want to make a little advertisement. One of the missions that we feel very close to our hearts as consecrated women is that of vocations and creating a culture of vocations in our society today. And there's one way that we're trying to help do that in Dallas. We have a holy hour to pray for vocations, and it's open to everyone. The last time we had moms and dads and young kids and college students and men, women, everyone from all over the spectrum there to pray for vocations. And we'll be doing it again next week. It's every fourth Thursday of the month from 7 to 9. 7 to 8 is a holy hour, and then we have a social afterwards, so I invite you all to please join us. We'd love to have you there.
Where?
At UD. Thank you so much, my backup here.
That was so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And now, please join me in offering a warm welcome to our Bishop, Kevin Farrell.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for inviting me back here again. I guess you're all Catholic because there are several seats up here in front. Well, at least that's a good sign. You're practicing Catholics. Jennifer, when she invited me to come back to speak to you all again, she suggested I speak on several topics, all of which I believe are very important. However, tonight I feel compelled to speak a little about a very important issue that is very much in the forefront of the news media during these days, and that is the recent regulations with respect to Health and Human Services, and what that means and why the Catholic Church is so opposed to this. But before I get into explaining to you a little of the details of that, I would like to make a very important distinction that is overlooked many times in our secular society and in our world today, and especially in the world of the news media. And that is a very important distinction between what is worship and what is religion. Now, most people never think of this, but part of the problem is a way of defining religion by the administration of our nation as worship. And what I mean by that is they define that a religion only applies to whether you go to church on Sunday and what church you go to. And religion is exercised inside of the church and has nothing to do with the rest of life, and much less to do with public life or the good order of society in general. And that is basically the philosophical idea behind many of the distinctions that are made that cause so much trouble and so many problems for our church today, and especially for Christian churches and the Catholic Church. If you think for one moment about the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the Old Testament, religion was basically, something that was dictated in the law of Moses and something that you did. In other words, you performed certain sacrifices, you did something wrong, to go and wash yourself 7 times in the river, or, to a whole series of things that you had to do, and a whole series of very carefully prescribed rites that you had to perform. Then you were in God's good graces again. Along came Jesus Christ, who revealed to us God and what God thinks of each and every one of us, and God's reason for our creation, and what God wants us to do in this life. And that was all revealed to us through the person of Jesus Christ. If you think of the four Gospels, it is just a series of stories and a series of events that take place, all of which go to tell us how we should live our lives. Now, when those stories were spoken, preached for the first time 2,000 years ago, obviously they didn't know, they didn't have, high-tech gadgets, they didn't have computers, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have any of these modern ways of communication that we have today. It was a completely different life, a completely different way of thinking. But what was fundamental and basic were the values that existed and the principles that are behind each and every one of those different stories that we read in the scriptures. When you go to Mass on a Sunday and you hear a parable that talks about the sower who went out to sow the seed in a field, and you say, oh yeah, what's that got to do with life today, in downtown Dallas? Well, it has a lot to do with life today. And the trick is, and the challenge is, for each and every one of us, is to understand what God trying to say to us through this story, as it were. To cut a long explanation short, I will tell you that it's all about living certain values and certain principles. And Christianity and Catholicism is very much about what we do every day, in every moment, how we think, what are our guiding principles, what are the fundamental values that guide our lives. Catholicism is not just about worship. It is about living every day of the week according to certain values and certain principles, and that is the great distinction, and that is the great challenge that those who believe in a secularist way that religion should be locked inside the four walls of the church, and has nothing to do with the rest of life. Whereas for us as Christians, that's a denial of our basic religion and the way we choose to practice our faith. Because for us, we receive nourishment in our churches. We are guided in our churches. We worship God in an act of praise and an act of adoration in church. But we live Catholicism. Catholicism isn't just professed, it's lived. And that is a very important distinction. And only when you understand that can you understand why there is such an uproar in our society today with this new regulation by HHS. That is the first distinction that you have to make, which is very important to understand. And we can never allow anybody to define us and to put us into a box or put us inside the walls of a church. That is not our faith. Our faith is practiced. Jennifer read, I presume, from the first letter of St. John tonight. What is it about? It's about practicing the love of God and how we express that love for God in the way we deal with each other. That is what our faith is all about. When Christ, whenever he spoke about charity, he spoke about justice. Why? Because that's what God wants, and that's what our faith and our lives are destined for. So to come back to the practical things, a couple of months ago, as a matter of fact, the last time I was here, I spoke to you about the threat of what was going to happen with these new regulations. And actually, on the 20th of January, it came through, despite what the president had guaranteed the Catholic Church. And he went back on his word and said, no, this is the way it's going to be. Let me from the outset say that this is not, as the media or as the administration would like to portray it. This is not about contraception. This is not a Catholic issue. This is not a contraceptive issue, and it's not a Catholic issue. This is an American issue. Because basically, this country was founded on one and the first principle, that we could worship our God freely, the way we wanted and the way we would determine how that God was to be worshipped. That is the First Amendment of our Constitution. So now, what has happened? Basically, what the administration decided in these regulations was that no, we were going to define what a religion is and how it should be. And what is very interesting in all of this is that it has defined religions as worship. So, all churches are exempt from this religion, from these regulations. All churches are exempt. In other words, every church. What does that mean? That means, the parish plant here. Doesn't mean the school. It doesn't mean any other external activity that may go on in that parish. It just means church and inside church and those who work in the church as such. So that is the distinction that they wish to make, and that is what they propose that we all must follow. Why is this so problematic? It's problematic because for the first time, we are not free to practice our Catholic faith, or the Christian faith, or any other faith, the Muslim faith. I spoke to the imam of the Muslims here just on Monday, yesterday, who called me up and said, this is a very serious matter, and we wish, if the Catholic Church is going to get involved in this as a court case, we wish to support you. And along with many other churches and many other organizations. But it is very important because this is the first time in the history of our nation that any government has ever tried to define what is religion and what is not religion. If you read these regulations, basically it comes down to that they will say that a religious institution is basically a church. So that immediately defines what we understand by Catholic faith. Our Catholic faith, we're all about living every day of the week. We go to church to receive, as it were, the energy from God to live every day during the week, and to live according to certain values, certain principles, certain moral conduct, code of conduct, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, it would exclude any work we do in Catholic hospitals. It would exclude any work that we do in schools, even in the elementary school that's here at St. Thomas Apostle. That's not covered. That's no longer a religious school. That is a school. Privately run, privately owned, but it's a school. It's not a religion, and it's not the exercise of religion. That is what is so problematic about all of this. We should not be misguided and think that it is just about the issue of contraception. It's not. That's what the media would like to do because that's what divides the Catholic Church. And that's what would divide many of us. Furthermore, the president then, having listened to all of this discussion and having, been beaten up left, right, and center, he then decides that he's going to compromise. But what is the compromise? Well, the compromise is nothing, because there is no compromise if you don't change the definition of what religion is. And that is exactly where we are today. We want to uphold the First Amendment of the Constitution because we can. Why? What is it that he does? I'll give you a very concrete example that I face every day these days. That is, what do I do for Catholic in all of the Catholic institutions? All Catholic institutions, for example, would have to pay for procedures, would have to pay for medicines, would have to pay for many different things which we believe is contrary to our faith and to our religion. We would have to pay for them. Well, they will say to me, well, that's okay because it's not your decision. Everybody is free to do one thing or another, and therefore everybody can follow their own conscience. And I will say to you, well, what about my conscience? Don't I have a right to determine and to do what I believe is right and I believe is correct? And what about all the millions of Catholics who believe this way? They have a right to practice their faith as they understand it and believe it without interference from any government. Then they will tell me, well, you, instead of having you pay for it, we will have all the insurance companies pay for it. Well, what does that mean? That's what I call accounting gymnastics. That just means that they're not going to put it on the bill they send me every year to buy insurance. And most major corporations, and most major in church corporations, such as churches, dioceses, the Diocese of Dallas runs its own insurance company. I don't buy insurance from anybody. I am the insurer. So we would be forced then actually to pay for all of these things that we believe are contrary to our Catholic faith. And that is why we should not take this very lightly. And we should not be carried away and not be influenced by the media that says this is basically just a question about contraception. It's not, and it's very far from being that. I would hope that all of you would clearly understand why the Catholic Church is so furious, I would say, at this particular moment, and so determined that we are not going to give up on the struggle and on this battle. And I would hope that all Catholics would do exactly the same thing. We cannot allow anybody to tell us how we live our faith. Our faith is revealed to us by God, interpreted by the Church, and that is what was guaranteed under First Amendment. Why do the founding fathers of this nation consider that so important that they made it the First Amendment? Because that's why they came to this nation. That's why they did it. And they didn't want to go back and have the king tell them how they should live their lives and how they should practice their faith, and they didn't want the king being the supreme ruler completely over every aspect of their life. The Church, on the other hand, will always say, yes, you do have a conscience, and you are required to educate your conscience, and then you're required to follow your conscience. Church is not mandating you to do one thing or another. The Church is teaching you, to tell you that this is the way that we believe that God wishes us to live our life. This is what's right, this is what's wrong. Whether you do that or not, that's not for me to judge. I can tell you, and I can convince you, I will try to convince you that one way is right or one way is wrong, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do. I'm going to tell you, this is what you should do, I will say to you. But, and that is why it is essential that today Catholics realize and Catholics support everything we try to do during these coming months to ensure that this legislation is overturned, changed, ruled. There is no compromise when it comes to principles, when it comes to values. There can be no compromise. This is not a political decision that we can just sit down around the table and say, yes, we will do this or we will not do that. Some people would like to say, well, this is political. It's not political. We didn't choose to get into this battle. We didn't choose to, do this at this particular time. We didn't choose to, take on the President of the United States with respect to this, just, because we had nothing else to do. We do this because we believe that this is essential to the practice of our Catholic faith in the world today. And that is why it's so important and so urgent that as Catholics you all understand what your role is in life. Many times young Catholics come up to me and they say, well, what are we supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to, first of all, be informed, know what your Catholic faith is all about, and then you have to learn how to practice it in the field in which you profess or you exercise some profession. You have to live your faith within what you do every day in your lives. It is also essential and important that you take the position that for the good of our society and the good of our world, that our faith we must have the freedom to practice constantly our Catholic faith. If we don't have that guarantee, well, we can all close up shop and go home. Or else you are transferring the title of God from the one, only God, to many other small little gods who will dictate and tell us what we should do and how we should live our lives. And that, my dear people, is not a good situation for us to be in. But that basically is what this regulation and what this fight is all about. It is all about our freedom. You don't have to believe as I believe. You don't have to, and I say this to non-Catholics as well, you don't have to agree with the Catholic Church, but you do have to agree that we all have a right to live according to our own faith in God. And that is what should guide us throughout this discussion with this political situation at this present moment. Is it going to be difficult? Yes, very much so. We're fighting. Last week I spoke on every television station in this town and every news radio that asked me to do it. Is it going to be difficult? Yes, it's going to be very difficult. In the end, will we prevail? I have great faith in the Catholic people. I believe that each and every one of you has an obligation and has, you must, I can't tell you how you must vote, I can't tell you what you must do, but I do think you have an obligation to study and to make sure that you avail yourself of every opportunity to exercise and guarantee that our nation lives according to those fundamental rights which were guaranteed to us under the Constitution of the United States. And no matter who tries to offend those rights, well, we need to, in a democratic and peaceful way, let our voice be heard on that matter. And I have tried to tell all the Catholics of this town in the diocese that's what they must do and that's what they should do. Whether they do it or not, that's a decision that you all have to make. I can only encourage you to do it. And furthermore, I would like to encourage you all to always be attentive and be up to date on what it is that happens in legislation such as this. Because this is what the day after tomorrow changes. Recently, I said to somebody that interviewed me, I said, well, how about if you put it into the field of the news media? Well, imagine if tomorrow, we have freedom of the press in the United States. And if you ever try to tell the press what to do, you will find yourself on the wrong side of the press and the media. But imagine if the President of the United States said tomorrow, all right, ladies and gentlemen of the press, you may not publish any article that is negative about my administration while I am the President of the United States. Now let me ask you all, what do you think that the media would do with that? They would go ballistic. Absolutely ballistic. Why? Because it infringes on a fundamental right. The right of free press, the right of free speech. That's what it does. The same thing must happen to the First Amendment that guarantees us the right to practice our faith and our religion. We need to go ballistic in a peaceful way. So I would hope that you would understand that and how important it is for the future of our church and for your own personal lives. Because, you know, it's going to affect each and every one of you. Today, it may be, as one person told me, what happens if the president decides that we're all going to eat pork every Friday and every Saturday? Well, then you affected a whole other segment of the religious world out there. What would you do then? Well, what's the difference? If you're mandating me to do one thing or another that's contrary to my faith, well, what is basically the difference? If you're mandating the press to only write positive articles about me, you're denying a right. You're doing exactly the same thing. And that is why this issue, even though it's the arguments is being framed in the idea of contraception, that's not really the big issue. That's topic for discussion on another day in another venue, and a very important and a very serious topic that is too. But that's not what's at stake right now. And you know, this is immediate and this needs to be taken care of. I would be happy to answer any question that you may have or to go on and talk about something else. But I do feel that this is very important. I would not have brought this topic up, would not have been my first choice, but I do see that this is extremely important, and extremely important not just for the Catholic Church, for all churches, all religions, all faiths, and all good American people who believe in the American system and the American way of life. Because the First Amendment is not about Catholics, and it's not about Baptists, and it's not about Presbyterians, Methodists. It's about people of all faiths. And whether you be Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, governs everybody, and we should be willing to defend that right. Any question that anybody may have, yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that it's not just about Catholics. Is there an action underway currently that's going to unite the religious beliefs of all to go to the administration?
Yes, there are groups from all faiths and from groups that are non-faith based. Who also believe in defending and upholding the First Amendment of the Constitution. Many different churches are involved. As I said to you here, I heard from one of the imams, which is the Muslim leader, the leader of the Muslim faith. I heard from one of them yesterday, who is willing to support, and their community is willing to, if this becomes a financial burden to the Catholic Church, they're willing to help. In as much as they possibly can. So there are many people who are willing. Yes?
the election's 9 months away. Do you think, I kind of think that the administration is going to say that they're going to change things, or just to get the issue off the table before the elections, and then keep enforcing what they're doing now after the election's over, where we have no chance to do anything about it voting-wise?
Well, I can't answer that question. I have no idea. And that's a rather political question. But I do believe that people of the United States are intelligent enough. I guess I'm the ultimate optimist that believes that people will do what they should do. But I also think that there are two other segments of government in the United States. We have the legislative branch, and I'm sure this will go to the Supreme Court, and I'm sure there will be legislation which we should all support to uphold the conscience, I forget what the new bill that's before the Congress is, to defend basically the right to live according to our conscience. Yes?
Some groups within the church, like Catholic Charities, have voiced support for these quote-unquote revisions. How's the church as a whole responding to this lack of unity within the church itself?
Well, I can tell you that I think that the Catholic Health Association made a terrible mistake. I think that they were informed and they just said, well, thank God they took the president at his word, and I think they issued the press statement before anybody knew. When the bishops of the United States heard what was said, they made a statement and said, well, we'll wait to see what the written word says. It's unfortunate that the Catholic Health Association did not wait for the written word. Today they're scrambling, trying to undo what they did. And I think there is basic unity in the Catholic Church. I think there is a lot more unity than we give the church credit for. I think the Catholic Health Association is, I would say, struggling to find a way to resolve the situation. But I think it was regrettable, terrible mistake. When I heard it, I said, without even having heard, I heard that message before I heard the president. And I said, that's a mistake, because having lived for 30 years in Washington, D.C., I know that you have to read the details, and you have to read not the text but the notes to know what the text means. So I would have said, wait until you see it. So yes.
While on details, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, actually when President Obama was going around trying to get support for this whole bill and this whole movement, they were behind him. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that right?
No, that's not correct.
But
we were behind universal healthcare reform.
Right. So here's the real question now. So they did throw some support behind the universal healthcare law, which this is a part of, because it gave the Department of Health and Human Services the authority to make this rule. So did the legislation hold this rule in it, or did the Department of Health and Human Services, as like a regulatory body, come in and say, this is what, this is how we define a church, and this is what churches have to do? That's precisely what this was not the legislation of the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops.
Absolutely not. Never was. And besides that, we don't actually, we speak always to principles and values. We don't speak to legislation, and we don't speak to, bills before the Congress and things like that, only when it applies to certain principles and values. The only thing we would say is, yes, we do need universal health care. How that is provided, that's not our job. Our job is to say that all people have a right to have the best possible health care they can possibly have. and it shouldn't be governed by the free market. In other words, whether you can pay for it or not. Because in our mind, every single human person, whether they be rich or poor, is created in the likeness and image of God, and therefore is due the same care and understanding that any other person would be. So we do provide and we do support, and we did support as a conference of bishops. We did push for universal healthcare reform. But we don't get into those kind of details. That's not our job. We just say there have to be certain principles and values. Now, do we get into details? Yes, when they attack certain principles and certain moral laws, and that's what happened when HHS decided to define, what it is that this new healthcare bill will cover and will not cover. So yes, you are correct. We did support healthcare reform because at the time there were 48 million Americans, I believe, who didn't have any access to healthcare. And there are still 48 million people who don't have access to healthcare. So they didn't solve the problem. Yes?
Can I just ask what your most pressing need from us is? Is it prayer? Is it to contact the administration or senators?
I would say two things. I would say three things. First of all, I would say yes, prayer. That we would change the minds and the hearts of people. I think we have to pray for individuals, and we have to pray for our nation as a whole. The second thing I would say is that you should all be informed, carefully informed, and that you should read what's truly going on and should not be carried away, even though there's a great danger in our society today, and younger people are more prone to this than anybody, and that is we live on sound bites. Because